1859, a search party on a frozen island in the Canadian Arctic found a small stone cairn. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was the only written record left by 129 men who had vanished 14 years earlier. The note said everything was fine. Then, in the margin, in a different hand, someone had come back and written something else. And that second message is the reason this story doesn't end where you think it does. In May of 1845, 2 ships left England carrying 129 men. Their names were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. And yes, someone in the Royal Navy really did name a ship Terror and then send it into the Arctic. Their mission: find the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the ice at the top of Canada that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. Empires had been chasing it for 300 years. Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, was chosen to finally finish the job. These weren't ordinary ships. They had reinforced iron bows to cut through pack ice, early steam engines for when the wind failed, and enough tinned food to last 3 years. On paper, this was the most advanced polar expedition ever assembled. 2 whaling ships spotted them in Baffin Bay in late July 1845, waiting for good conditions to enter the passage. That was the last time any European ever saw them alive. For 2 years, nothing. No word, no wreckage, no returning ship. At first, nobody panicked. Arctic expeditions were expected to disappear from contact for long stretches. That was normal. The ships were stocked for 3 years. There was no reason to worry. But 3 years came and went. Then Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, started making noise. She pushed the British Admiralty. She pushed the newspapers. She pushed anyone who would listen. Until in 1848, the Navy finally launched what would become the largest search operation in its history. Ships, sledges, overland parties. Some searchers spent years of their own lives looking for men who were already dead by the time the search began. They found almost nothing. A camp, some graves. Then, for years, silence again. Look at how much ground those searchers had to cover. Thousands of miles of Arctic coastline, on foot and by ship, looking for a handful of men in a landscape built to swallow them without a trace. Whatever happened to that crew had already happened long before anyone started looking. The search itself was arriving at a scene that had gone cold years earlier. In 1850, searchers found the expedition's first winter camp on a place called Beechey Island. And there, preserved in the permafrost, were 3 graves. The bodies inside were almost perfectly intact. The Arctic cold had mummified them. When scientists exhumed them more than a century later, in the 1980s, the men still had their eyelashes. These 3 men died in the expedition's very first winter, 1846, before the real disaster had even begun. It wasn't simple starvation. Autopsies found signs of tuberculosis and pneumonia, and later toxicology tests found unusually high lead levels in their bodies, possibly from badly soldered tin cans that had been rush-ordered for the voyage. Researchers still debate exactly how much that lead contributed, whether it was a direct killer or one more factor wearing down men who were already sick and malnourished. But even as an open question, it points to something unsettling. Some of the expedition's damage may have started long before the ice ever trapped them. Now back to that cairn. In 1859, a search party led by Francis McClintock found it on King William Island, containing the only written account the crew ever left behind. The first part of the note was dated May 1847. It said, in effect, "All is well. Franklin is in command. The ships are wintering safely in the ice."
Then, squeezed into the margins of that exact same page, someone had come back, nearly a year later, April 1848, and added an update. Franklin was dead. So were 23 other officers and crewmen. The ships had been trapped in ice for over a year and a half and were now being abandoned completely. The 105 survivors were setting out on foot, dragging heavy sledges, aiming for a river hundreds of miles to the south. One piece of paper, 2 messages, 11 months apart. The first one calm, the second one signing the death warrant of everyone still alive. None of the 105 men who walked south were ever seen by a European again. Here's the part that took Britain over 100 years to accept. Long before any British search party pieced together the full story, Inuit hunters in the region had already seen it happen. In 1854, an explorer named John Ray met Inuit near Pelly Bay, who described a group of 35 to 40 white men, starving, dragging boats and sledges, walking south along the coast.
Later, other Inuit found the bodies, dozens of them, scattered near a river mouth. And they told Ray something else. Something that would get him blacklisted by London society for the rest of his life. The bodies showed signs that the survivors had eaten the dead. When Ray reported this back to England, the reaction wasn't horror at what the men had endured. It was outrage that he would repeat such a claim about British sailors. Charles Dickens personally attacked the credibility of Inuit testimony in print. The Admiralty distanced itself. Ray's reputation never recovered. It took until the 1980s and 90s, well over a century later, for scientists studying the actual bones to confirm exactly what the Inuit had said all along. When researchers finally examined the skeletal remains recovered from King William Island, they found something unmistakable: cut marks. Knife marks, specifically, in the pattern you'd expect from someone deliberately removing meat from bone.
Roughly a third of all the bones examined showed this kind of damage, and it wasn't limited to the earliest, most desperate stage of survival. Some bones had been deliberately broken open, consistent with extracting marrow, the last possible source of calories once everything else was gone. Researchers call this end-stage behavior. It only happens when a group has exhausted every other option and death is no longer a future risk, but an immediate certainty. One set of remains has since been tentatively matched through isotope and DNA analysis, with the usual caveats that come with century-and-a-half-old bone evidence, to James Fitzjames, the expedition's third in command. He's the very officer who is believed to have helped write that second, desperate message in the margin of the note. If that identification holds up, the man who helped record the expedition's death sentence may have become one of its final victims. The ships themselves stayed missing for over 165 years. Despite dozens of search expeditions, despite modern sonar, despite everything, Erebus and Terror simply weren't found until 2014 and 2016, and only because searchers finally started taking Inuit oral histories seriously as navigational evidence, instead of dismissing them the way the Admiralty once dismissed John Ray. But finding the ships didn't close the case, it reopened it. The wrecks were found remarkably intact, sitting upright on the sea floor, largely undamaged, in locations that don't fully match where the note said the ships were abandoned. That mismatch has led to one of the more debated theories in Franklin research, that a small number of men may have gone back on board and tried to resail one of the ships south sometime after the "all hands abandon" message was written. It's not the consensus view, and plenty of researchers are skeptical, but no one has fully explained the location of the wrecks either. Which means the last chapter of this story, who was alive, where, and for how long after 1848, still isn't something anyone can say with certainty. 129 men, 2 ships built to survive anything. A note that flipped from routine to catastrophe in 11 months. Bones that confirmed what one man was destroyed for saying out loud a century before anyone believed him. And still, no one knows exactly how the last survivors died, or how many of them there really were. The Arctic kept the ships for 165 years. It's still keeping the rest of the story. If you want the next one of these the moment it's out, that's what the subscribe button is for.